The scorching sun blazed high above the horizon, pressing its relentless heat down upon the sprawling airfield. Waves of heat shimmered off the tarmac, distorting the view of the lined-up Apache helicopters that stood like steel beasts waiting for release. The rhythmic clanking of metal, the thuds of crates being set down, and the hum of distant engines blended into the constant, almost hypnotic symphony of preparation. Dust, stirred by hurried boots and the occasional gust of hot wind, danced in the air and clung to sweat-soaked uniforms. The air was heavy with the smell of jet fuel and machine oil, a scent so thick it became part of every breath. Among the crew moving with steady urgency was a young woman, her presence subtle, almost unnoticeable. She was one of many in the ground team assigned to the Apaches, her figure blending into the uniformity of coveralls and protective gloves. With her head bent low and movements efficient, she gave the impression of someone focused solely on the job. Her hair was tied back tightly beneath a cap, her face streaked with a faint smear of dust, though her eyes gleamed with an intensity that belied her quiet demeanor. She hauled boxes of ammunition with a practiced rhythm, sliding belts of deadly rounds into compartments as though she had done it 1,000 times before. The pilots walked past her, their visors glinting in the sunlight, their bodies cloaked in heavy flight gear. They were used to the sight of ground crew bustling around them, fueling, arming, and checking the machines they would soon take to the skies. Most paid her no more attention than they would to a tool being passed into their hands, just another worker in the endless cycle of missions. Yet, for her, every movement carried a quiet weight. She kept her head low, shoulders tight, careful not to draw eyes toward herself for longer than a moment. The Apaches loomed beside her, hulking silhouettes of dark green and black, their rotors creaking slightly as the wind nudged them. She placed a hand against the cool metal for balance as she lifted another belt of ammunition. The rounds gleamed dully, each one a promise of destruction once the helicopter roared to life. Her muscles strained, but she worked without hesitation, the repetition almost meditative. For an outsider, it was merely routine, just a woman doing her job, arming war machines. But inside her chest, her heart beat a little too fast, her breath a little too shallow, as though each crate carried not just weight but a shadow from her past. The ground vibrated as one of the Apaches powered up its auxiliary systems. The deep mechanical hum reverberated in her bones, making her pause for the briefest second before resuming. She knew she could not afford hesitation. Around her, the other crew moved with seamless precision, their voices raised just enough to cut through the roar of machinery. She added her presence to the flow of the work, invisible in the collective blur. To anyone watching casually, she was nothing more than a dedicated ground technician. Still, the pilots who passed by occasionally offered brief nods of acknowledgement. Some gave a muttered thanks as they strode toward their aircraft, their minds already in the skies, rehearsing the maneuvers and objectives ahead. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, slowed his pace as he noticed her at work. His eyes lingered longer than most, though she didn't see it. Her sleeve slid a little as she bent to lift another box, exposing the faint outline of something dark inked into her skin. The pilot's brow furrowed as the image caught his attention. It was gone in an instant when she adjusted her sleeve, but his mind replayed it sharply, like a flash of lightning in an otherwise cloudless sky. Unaware of his gaze, she continued loading the ammunition with steady determination. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her glove, smearing more dust across her temple. The sound of laughter from two nearby mechanics drifted past, but she remained silent, her focus never wavering. Around her, the airfield thrummed with urgency and routine. Engines growled, tools clattered, voices shouted orders across the noise, but for her, the world narrowed to the task before her hands. The sun dipped slightly, casting longer shadows across the tarmac. One by one, the Apaches came alive, their cockpits glowing faintly as systems warmed. The young woman stepped back for a moment, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths as she surveyed her work. She had loaded countless rounds, each one in its place, each compartment sealed. It looked perfect, seamless. Yet in the reflection of the Apache's glass, her own eyes stared back at her, wide with a flicker of something unspoken. A memory, a warning, or perhaps guilt. She quickly looked away and turned back to fetch the next crate. The pilot who had noticed the mark on her wrist still stood nearby, his helmet tucked under one arm, his gaze locked on her. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as though trying to decide if what he had seen was real. For the moment, she remained unaware, lost in the rhythm of her work. But the silence that stretched between them, even through the chaos of the airfield, was thick with an unseen tension. Something had been noticed, something that wasn't meant to be. And though she didn't know it yet, her careful mask was already beginning to crack. The crate felt heavier than the others, or perhaps her arms were beginning to tire under the unrelenting sun. She shifted her weight, balancing the load against her hip as she approached the open side compartment of the Apache. Dust swirled around her boots, clinging to her uniform as the dull clinks of ammunition echoed faintly inside the metal shell of the helicopter. She crouched, steadying the crate on the lip of the compartment, and as she reached in to guide the belt of shells into its place, her glove slipped. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The edge of her sleeve rode upward, pushed by the strain of her bent arm, and the black lines burned into her skin surfaced in plain view. The ink was stark against the pale underside of her wrist, the edges sharp despite the years that had passed since it was carved there. It was not decorative, not the kind of mark one would get on a whim. It carried weight, the kind of weight that lived in the shadows of locked files and whispered rumors. The pilot, standing just a few feet away, caught the sight immediately. His eyes, half distracted a moment before, sharpened in an instant. The shape was unmistakable. His breath hitched in his chest, the heat of the airfield forgotten, the clamor of voices and engines fading into the background as his gaze fixed on that symbol. He froze, helmet still tucked under his arm, visor reflecting the glint of sunlight. His mind reeled back to the briefings he had read years ago, scraps of information that most had dismissed as rumor. That tattoo was not supposed to exist anymore. It belonged to a program shrouded in secrecy, a project that the military had buried as though it had never been real. The few who had known about it whispered that its members had either disappeared or been erased. And yet, here it was, inked clearly on the wrist of a woman who was supposed to be just another member of the ground crew. She felt his eyes before she saw them. Her movements faltered, the belt of ammunition catching awkwardly for a moment before sliding into place. Slowly, almost mechanically, she pulled her sleeve back. Down over her wrist, her glove tugged higher to cover what little remained visible. She didn't dare look at him, didn't dare meet the weight of his stare. Instead, she forced her body to continue, moving as though nothing had happened, though her heartbeat thundered in her chest. But the pilot couldn't unsee it. The image had seared itself into his memory, and no matter how she tried to hide it, he knew. His jaw tightened, and he shifted slightly closer, not enough to draw attention from the others bustling around the flight line, but enough that she would feel the nearness of his presence. His silence spoke louder than words, a question hanging heavily between them. Why do you have that mark? She finished securing the last of the belt, her fingers trembling only slightly, though she prayed no one noticed. Wiping her brow with the back of her arm, she finally dared to glance up. Her eyes met his for a fleeting second, and in that instant, she knew. He had seen it. The recognition in his gaze was too sharp, too knowing to be mistaken. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and forced a faint, neutral smile as though trying to disarm suspicion. But the smile faltered quickly under his unblinking stare. The noise of the airfield returned in waves, the engines roaring louder now, the ground crew shouting orders back and forth, the metallic slam of crates being dropped nearby. Around them, the rhythm of preparation carried on, oblivious to the quiet battle that had sparked in the space between the two of them. He took a step back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left her. It wasn't hostility, not yet, but it was something far more dangerous, recognition mixed with curiosity. She turned swiftly, reaching for another crate as though to bury the moment beneath layers of work, but her thoughts were unraveling. She had been careful for so long. Years of keeping her sleeves down, her gloves snug, her posture careful, her story consistent. She had convinced herself that no one would ever notice, that the past could remain hidden beneath fabric and silence. But one slip, one careless motion, and everything she had tried to bury had been dragged into the light. The pilot adjusted his grip on his helmet, his jaw tightening as if holding back words. He wanted to ask, to confront her right there, but the chaos of the airfield was no place for it. For now, he stayed silent, but his silence was not relief, it was a promise. He would not forget what he had seen. And she, already feeling the weight of his gaze pressing into her back as she bent once more to lift the ammunition, knew the fragile wall she had built around her identity was beginning to crumble. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting long, sharp shadows across the Apaches as their engines roared louder, preparing for flight. The airfield seemed unchanged, just another day of war machines being armed for their purpose. Yet, within that single fleeting moment, the balance of secrecy had shifted. One man had seen what was never meant to be seen, and one woman knew the past she had fought to silence was already stirring back to life. The last of the crates was stacked neatly against the wall, the work for the day nearly finished. The crew began dispersing, some heading toward the mess hall, others gathering tools and equipment into carts. The noise of the airfield softened as the Apaches, fully armed and prepped, stood waiting for their next orders. The woman wiped her hands against her trousers, pretending not to notice the way one particular pilot lingered near the shadows of the hangar, his helmet still tucked under his arm. His stance was casual to the untrained eye, but she felt the weight of his gaze pressing against her back, steady and deliberate. She tried to convince herself she was imagining it, that perhaps he had already dismissed what he thought he had seen. But she knew better. That tattoo was not the kind of thing that went unnoticed, not by someone who had been trained to look deeper, to question, to remember. She picked up her water canteen, lifting it to her lips with trembling hands, and in that instant she heard his boots against the concrete. He was approaching. "Where did you get that tattoo?" His voice was even, almost casual, but the edge beneath it was sharp enough to cut. The canteen paused at her lips. Her throat closed, and for a moment, she couldn't swallow. Slowly, she lowered the container, forcing herself to meet his eyes. They were steady, focused, with none of the distraction she'd seen in the others. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity, he was demanding an explanation. For a second, she considered lying, spinning some harmless story. A shop, a design, something meaningless. But the look in his eyes told her it wouldn't work. He knew. Not the whole truth, perhaps, but enough to know that whatever she said mattered. She forced a small laugh, trying to make it sound careless. "It's just ink," she said, shrugging lightly. "Got it years ago. Doesn't mean anything." His jaw tightened. He didn't smile, didn't look away. He studied her as if dissecting every movement, every flicker of expression across her face. She felt exposed, as though the thin layer of fabric between them wasn't enough to hide the truth pulsing beneath her skin. "That's not just ink," he said finally, his voice dropping lower so no one nearby could overhear. "I've seen it before. Not many people have, but I have. And I know it isn't the kind of thing you walk into a tattoo parlor and get on a whim." Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. The world around them seemed to dim, the noise of engines and shouts fading until all that remained was the silence between his words. She forced herself to keep breathing, to keep her face steady. "You're mistaken," she said softly, her tone calm, but her hand tightened around the canteen until her knuckles whitened. He stepped a fraction closer, close enough that she caught the faint scent of sweat and machine oil clinging to his uniform. "No," he said, almost in a whisper, "I'm not mistaken. I've heard about people who wore that mark. People who disappeared. Tell me who you are." Her lips parted, but no words came. Panic clawed at the edges of her chest, but she couldn't let it show. "Not here. Not now." She forced herself to lift her chin, meeting his stare with as much steadiness as she could muster. "You're reading too much into nothing," she said, each word measured. "It's just a tattoo. That's all." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick, charged with an unspoken truth. She could feel the questions burning in him, the desire to press harder, to demand answers she couldn't give. And yet, something held him back. Perhaps the awareness of where they stood, surrounded by others who might notice if his voice grew too sharp. Or perhaps it was the flicker of fear he glimpsed in her eyes, a fear she was trying desperately to bury. Finally, he pulled back slightly, though his eyes never wavered. "Maybe," he said, his tone colder now, "but I don't believe you." She exhaled slowly, her lungs aching from the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He turned as though to walk away, but she knew it wasn't over. The suspicion had rooted itself in him, and it wouldn't be so easily dismissed. He had seen the mark, and no lie, no careful smile, would erase that image from his mind. As his footsteps faded, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, pressing her hands against the side of the crate as if to ground herself. She had survived confrontations before, had lived years balancing on the edge of discovery. But this felt different. This man wasn't going to let it go. And she knew, with a sinking certainty, that her carefully built disguise was unraveling faster than she could hold it together. The hangar was nearly empty by the time the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fading streaks of crimson and gold. The roar of the airfield had quieted into a low hum, distant engines fading as helicopters lifted into the darkening sky one by one. Fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, casting pale shadows across the rows of machinery and equipment. She lingered near the back, her work gloves tucked into her belt, her head lowered as though she were still busy organizing crates. In truth, her pulse hadn't slowed since the confrontation earlier. Every breath felt sharp, heavy with the knowledge that he had seen too much. She thought perhaps he would let it go, that the distractions of duty would erase the memory of her sleeve slipping and the black lines on her skin. But when she heard the familiar echo of boots against concrete, steady and deliberate, her stomach knotted. She didn't turn. She already knew who it was. The pilot stopped a few feet away, silent for a moment. She could feel his presence pressing into the space between them, patient but unrelenting. Finally, his voice cut through the quiet. "You can lie out there in front of everyone. Not here. Not with me." Her hands froze over the edge of a crate. She forced herself to straighten, slowly, and turned to face him. His eyes locked onto hers, no longer merely curious but determined, as though he had already decided that the truth was within reach and he wouldn't leave until he had it. She swallowed hard. "You're mistaken. You don't know what you saw." He stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "I know exactly what I saw. That mark, you think no one remembers it, but I do. Years ago, they warned us about a unit that didn't officially exist. The kind of unit that vanished when its purpose was over. The mark was their signature. And now here you are, wearing it like a scar you can't get rid of." His words struck like a blade. She wanted to deny it, to deflect again, but the weariness of years weighed too heavily on her chest. Slowly, her shoulders slumped. She glanced away, her gaze finding the shadowed floor of the hangar, where oil stains marked the concrete like ghosts of machines long gone. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered, her voice tight. "I thought if I stayed low, kept my head down, no one would ever recognize it. But you did." The pilot's jaw clenched. He leaned against the nearest crate, waiting. He didn't push further, but his silence demanded answers. She drew in a shaky breath. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I wasn't supposed to be here at all. Years ago, they recruited me into something different. Something off the books. We trained in places that don't show up on maps, did things I still don't want to remember. They told us we were shaping the future, that we were necessary for missions too dangerous, too invisible, for anyone else to know about. And for a while, I believed them." Her eyes lifted, meeting his again, filled with the heaviness of memory. "But one mission went wrong. Badly. Half my unit never came back, and the rest of us were written off, dead, erased. That was the deal. If you survived, you didn't. Not officially. They cut ties, destroyed records, and left us to disappear. I took the chance to vanish. I buried my name, my history, everything. I came here because it was quiet, ordinary. Just work. No one asks questions of the ground crew. No one notices." The pilot studied her, the intensity in his gaze. Softened now by something else, something like recognition. He shifted, his voice lower, almost cautious. "So why keep the tattoo? You could have gotten rid of it, covered it, anything." She glanced down at her wrist, tugging her sleeve instinctively over the mark. "Because it's the only proof that I ever existed. Without it, I'm no one. Just a ghost. And maybe I wanted to remember, even if I didn't want anyone else to see." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy but fragile. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face, as though trying to process what she had just laid bare. "You know what this means," he said finally. "If anyone else sees it, if anyone else realizes." "I know," she interrupted sharply, her voice cracking. "It's why I've lived every day waiting for it to end. For someone to notice. For someone like you." Her words echoed faintly in the hangar, lingering long after she fell silent. The pilot stared at her, torn between duty and something deeper, unspoken. She had revealed enough to damn herself, enough to unravel whatever life she had managed to build here. And yet, instead of reporting her immediately, he hesitated. The hum of the airfield continued outside, the world moving forward as though nothing had changed. But inside the hangar, the weight of her confession hung like a storm cloud, pressing down on both of them. She stood motionless, waiting for his choice, whether he would become the end of her fragile life of anonymity or the only person willing to keep her secret alive. The night was thick with the low vibrations of engines humming in the distance, the rhythmic thunder of Apaches taking off one by one into the darkness. Their shadows cut across the airfield, blades churning the warm evening air, lights blinking faintly as they disappeared into the horizon. Inside the hangar, the world seemed quieter, as if suspended in a fragile bubble of stillness that neither of them dared to break too quickly. The pilot stood rigid, helmet under his arm, eyes fixed on the woman before him. She remained rooted where she was, her hands curled into fists at her sides, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He had heard her confession, every word of it etched into his mind like steel on stone. The truth weighed heavily between them, but what to do with it, that was the question neither could voice aloud. He could feel it in her silence, in the way her gaze flickered toward him then quickly darted away. She was waiting, not for comfort, not for forgiveness, but for judgment. "You know I can't just forget this," he said at last, his tone measured but heavy with conflict. "That mark, that history, you're not supposed to be here. If I report you, it all comes out." Her lips parted, but no words came immediately. She looked at him with wide, searching eyes, as though trying to read if there was any trace of mercy in his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, almost pleading. "And if you do, what happens to me? You think they'll welcome me back? You think they'll forgive what I walked away from? No, they'll erase me for real this time. Erase everything. Maybe you think that's justice, but it won't stop with me. You know how they work. If they buried my unit once, they'll bury it again, completely." He exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face, torn between instincts drilled into him by years of training and the unsettling humanity that her words stirred inside him. Duty demanded one thing, but duty, he realized, was not always as simple as it appeared on paper. Her voice hardened, trembling but determined. "All I wanted was to live quietly. To be invisible. That's why I came here, why I do this. I'm not dangerous. I'm not your enemy. I'm just tired." He looked at her, really looked at her. She didn't stand like a soldier anymore. She stood like someone exhausted, someone who had carried too many years of secrets on her back and now found herself cornered with nowhere left to run. The mark on her wrist was more than ink, it was a chain linking her to ghosts she could never shake off. The silence stretched. Outside, the thundering Apaches grew fainter, swallowed by the night sky. Here, inside, the weight of decision pressed harder. He tightened his grip on his helmet, feeling the smooth, cold surface beneath his fingers, grounding himself in something solid. "You put me in a position I can't ignore," he said at last. His voice wasn't harsh, but it carried the weight of reality. "If anyone else sees, if anyone else asks questions, I won't be able to protect you. Do you understand that?" She nodded quickly, desperate. "I know. I'll be careful. More careful than before. No one else will notice. Just, please." Her voice faltered, breaking on the last word. For the first time, his expression softened. There was no denying what he had seen, no pretending that the secret mark on her wrist was meaningless. But there was also no denying what he saw in her now, the fragile humanity, the desperation to hold on to a life she had built out of the scraps of her past. She was not the shadowy threat the tattoo suggested. She was something else entirely, a reminder that the buried past never stays buried, and that those caught in its grip are often more victim than villain. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "I won't say anything, not yet, but you need to understand, this doesn't go away. Not for me, not for you. And if it ever comes back to haunt us both, don't think I'll be able to shield you." Her breath escaped in a shudder, half relief, half dread. "That's all I can ask," she whispered. For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of distant engines filling the space between them. The decision was made, but it brought no peace. Instead, it left a lingering uncertainty, a shadow neither of them could banish. He turned away at last, striding toward the hangar doors, his silhouette swallowed by the pale glow of the lights outside. She remained behind, her body trembling as though she had just stepped away from a precipice. Her hand drifted to her wrist, fingers brushing over the hidden mark beneath her sleeve. It had once been a symbol of belonging, then a curse of exile. Now, it was a secret bound to another soul, a pilot who had seen what no one else was ever meant to see. The night air drifted into the hangar, cool and heavy with the scent of fuel and dust. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, knowing the fragile balance of her life had shifted. Nothing had changed outwardly, the airfield still moved, the helicopters still flew, but everything within her had. The tattoo had been noticed, the silence had been broken, and now she lived not only with her own fear but with his knowledge. And though he had walked away, she knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something neither of them fully understood.